this is the part of the show when we use our legal eagle. I love this part. I got to be honest, I love this part of the show. Joseph Kotrie Monson, who's a lawyer and broadcaster, joins us now to have a look at the legal stories. I've got to start with this because I saw this and I thought, I've got to bring this to Joseph. Okay, so here's the headline. A prolific robber is 24 years old. He suffered a broken leg and a police dog bite when he was arrested. Now, this gentleman, Mr. Stowe, had 51 previous offences, including robbery, and the list goes on and on. Now, apparently, he was stealing a bike, which had been stolen in East Yorkshire. He was tackled by 2 police dogs. So, he obviously, in the whole thing, he got chomped or something by the police dog, and he was forcibly brought off the bike. Apparently, his solicitors are said to be involved in taking action against the police. The Humberside police haven't received anything yet. But Joseph, let me ask you. So if you're a prolific criminal and you get hurt in doing your quote-unquote trade by either a police dog or what have you, I've seen lots of ads for, did you fall down a pothole? You can sue. But is this the same? Could he, if he wanted to, could he bring an action against the police for letting their police dog, bite him in the course of the police dog's duty, so to speak?
Yes, you're right. The 1990s didn't just bring us Britpop, Trisha. It didn't just bring us Trisha to our screens. It also brought us compensation and blame culture. Mm-hmm. Is this a story about that? You framed your question to me today in a slightly playful way, of course, whether or not, and you know it well because we've talked about your legal and forensic skills over the past, whether or not, Trisha, this person was prolific, we both know is irrelevant. The point is the specific circumstances. Is this being spun by the media to turn it into a story about kind of, if someone's stealing from me, if someone's coming to my home, can I not defend myself? Is it that type of story involving police trying to do their job or something else? Let me say this. First of all, police dogs serve an appropriate and necessary function in crime fighting in our society, but to detain, not to maim. They serve that function. And the starting point with regard to somebody who is fleeing, and the law is clear on this, been decided in the Court of Appeal, if the person voluntarily accepted the risk of damage by failing to stop when warned. Now, that means that somebody who is evading crime, reasonable force can be brought to bring that person to the police, in the same way that a police officer can chase somebody down and barge them over. But it must be reasonable. And these dogs are highly trained to know how far to go. Important factors. The purpose in the first place. Why is the person being detained? How reasonable the level of force was. These are important questions. What was the intent of the officer? Sick him from an officer is not going to go down well in court in a compensation claim, as opposed to, well, this person must be detained. And of course, these officers, these handlers, these one handler dogs, that relationship, they know each other well. Injuries can be a clue, of course. And in that case that you've described, as I understand it, this was a very serious neck injury. Judging by the look of a photograph I've seen, if it's accurate, looks like the type of neck injury that if it was a centimetre or two the other way, it could have been a fatal case. That's not to say the officer did anything wrong. And we know that a claim hasn't yet been brought. Maybe a claim will never be brought. In these circumstances, perhaps the past record of the dog handler and that dog would be brought into focus. Again, police officers using dogs in that way, together, they are a dangerous weapon, potentially.
Right.
Like any other weapon we give our police officers if it's necessary.
Yeah, I was going to say, like a taser could be misused. We won't even get into guns in the States, but just the same way as, and there have been cases where a taser has been used too wrong or indiscriminately or caused lasting damage. Or in some cases, I know with at least one black man killed. There's a case to answer. So that's exactly the same as a dog. A police dog and its handler is a weapon, and to be viewed from that same point of view.
Yes, and please, anyone who's tearing their hair out thinking, oh, the criminals all have it their way, let me say this. Courts make incredible allowances, really generous for people who are in the process of fighting crime, people who are under threat themselves, for example, when they're being attacked. And courts will err on the side of the victim or the person, more accurately, who is not the wrongdoer when you're talking about a police officer, for example. You know, these are the types of considerations that are at the forefront of courts' minds. But yes, that you can't use police dogs as weapons to inflict punishment. Punishment is carried out by the judicial system.
So it's that fine line between stopping the criminal and not calling the dog off quickly enough. So all of that would be looked into. It is fascinating. It is absolutely fascinating. Let's move on. Lots of we get lots of headlines about this. Just Stop Oil at the first day of the proms, BBC proms. Staging, going on stage and what have you, and stopping things. I mean, there's been Wimbledon, there's been all of those sorts of things. I'm interested to know, do these new laws against protesting, would they cover something like the proms? Do they cover something like Wimbledon, or is it trespass? Well, how does that work?
What has happened, and remember we had those Kill the Bill protests. Yeah, part of the considerations, part of what people were complaining about in those protests was the principle that when somebody is more than inconvenienced, but kind of quite vaguely described as atmosphere being disturbed and people being disrupted more than to a moderate extent, then that could result in criminal penalties. Now, it's important to say at this stage, Trisha, isn't it, that protest has always been disruptive.
I know, that's why I was shaking my head. It's like, when you talk about the suffragettes, when you talk about lots of the things that maybe we do take for granted these days were brought about initially by these sorts of protests.
Much worse, in fact. I have to say this, the suffragettes broke windows, they planted bombs.
Chained themselves to railings, threw themselves under horses.
But once you're using explosives in this country, what are you regarded as? A protester? No, nowadays, exactly, a terrorist. People somehow, with their rose-tinted spectacles, think that Emmeline Pankhurst, with her nice bonnet and her beautiful dress, somehow primly said, down with this sort of thing. I really would like the vote. They obtained it, actually, through predominantly, or at least majorly, violent means. Yes. Not just disruptive. So I have to say, there's always a balance to be struck, but government should be at pains, no matter how bloody annoying some of these people can be and unrealistic as far as Just Stop Oil is concerned, because I tell you what, people die tomorrow if we just stop oil today, because our economy, our ability to look after the vulnerable is too ingrained at the moment with the need for fossil fuels.
It needs something that needs long planning and what have you. But just stopping. So, I mean, can they be arrested for doing something like, going onto the courts at Wimbledon or going onto the stage?
Listen,
at the proms?
you can be arrested for calling a police officer a bleep. You can be arrested for breach of the peace. Doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be guilty of an offence, because breach of the peace is dealt with civilly, usually by way of something called a bind over, no criminal record. But you can be extracted from a situation where you're making a kerfuffle, because this is England. This is Britain. We don't particularly like a kerfuffle, do we? But in terms of penalties, yeah, there are going to be increasing penalties. People will be going to prison increasingly. And the reason I can say that with some confidence is this: Just Stop Oil, again, the clue of the impatience is in the name. We've all noticed, haven't we, as the summer's crept up, this is no longer once every few months.
No,
It's a movement that's gathering pace. The problem is, with that unrealistic timetable and demand that they have now, we are looking at a situation where the likelihood is their frustration will increase, not decrease. That means more regularity, God forbid, disruption spilling over into violence.
Well, you just sort of think that if government sat down and actually talked with them, but there's all of this pressure, seeing them as unworthy of talking. And I'm fascinated by the fact that whenever these organizations are involved, it's not like the youth of yesterday. These are professors, these are grey-haired grannies and what have you. And you kind of wish that the politicians, instead of just unleashing headlines against them, would actually, PR tells me if you were seen to sit down and talk with them, it's just basic public relations,
That's
sit
right.
down, be seen to be talking to them. I think it would dampen a lot of this. But, that's common sense.
I completely agree with you, but this is a government that enjoys grandstanding on a populist basis. Priti Patel was the architect in many ways of this narrative. Where is she now? Well, we're dealing with it, aren't we? The consequences of her lack of engagement. We should be talking to each other. This is a society in which people who don't agree with each other don't talk to each other. As a result, they become more entrenched. They demonize each other. And what do we end up? We end up with Just Stop Oil on one end, and we end up with people being sent to Rwanda on the other.
And that's where we're coming to. This now, yet again, I was interested to see. And again, I love your phrase about grandstanding. And when it goes nowhere, let's attack the trans lobby. But that's another thing. Rwanda deportations delayed until New Year at the earliest. I kind of snickered at that headline. This is the Supreme Court. They're going to be starting October the 2nd to hear the government appeal against the Court of Appeal judgment. And this is kind of hopeful. If it loses the case, the government will be left without the ability to remove illegal migrants. Let me just ask you this. How much money is this costing us? It seems to me the amount of money that the government must be spending in legal representation and bringing this back to court and Supreme Court and appeals court, etc., etc. If they spent that money on ramping up their civil service to properly process the migrants, they wouldn't have this problem anyway. They're so welded to this headline of send them to Rwanda. They're spending millions when they could actually start solving this just by employing people to look at paperwork.
I think probably the thing that is important to recognize is that they've probably been advised behind the scenes anyway. If you remember the first case and the Court of Appeal case, Rwanda is not a suitable and safe place.
They know that.
It's not capable of delivering reliable asylum outcomes. They don't have the appropriate justice system. It's what and the Court of Appeal have been straight on it. The interesting thing is this: I don't think they're going to win this case in the Supreme Court, but I think they want to show again, as this government has done time and again, it's not our fault, it's the judges' fault. Well, judges won't let you do something unlawful. And one friend of mine once said, well, judges think that they're somehow part of our political system. Well, actually, in America, their kids are taught, as they should be taught here, that the judiciary is part of the political system. It keeps the government, the elected government, from acting unlawfully. The frustrating thing for me is this: doesn't the government always have a go at legal aid lawyers? Doesn't the government always say these fat cat lawyers spending all of our money? This government is spending millions of pounds on lawyers on a doomed Supreme Court appeal, while at the same time, the lawyers representing these poor 9 or 10 would-be deportees, none of whom will be deported.
Yeah, it's a handful. It's a handful,
pennies.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's an absolute handful of people that we're talking about. And, of course, there's a reciprocal agreement with Rwanda to accept refugees from them back. And this is costing. I don't think anybody really highlights how many millions, what the cost of this to Britain. It far outweighs any saving that they're going to be making, sending a handful of refugees to, if they do, which they won't. It's a very expensive public relations cost, and it's not doing the judiciary any favours, is it? By, as you say, by denigrating and saying it's all their fault.
They want the judiciary to find against them. This is the hallmark of this government.
They need it.
They want to create another bad guy. Do you remember Scarface? Say goodbye to the bad guy. Say hello to the good guy. I don't know. But this is it's deluded. They've accepted feeble promises, empty promises from Rwanda. So the Court of Appeal have already said, and said that those are assurances a court can rely on. There's no way that Rwanda refugees are going to be coming this way. It's more window dressing, Trisha. It's more grandstanding. This is all about making some type of argument for an ineffectual government that's saying, look, we're doing all these hard things. And when they don't work, say, like Donald Trump, I would have been able to affect all this change if it wasn't for all these weak people standing in my way. Yeah. No, this is the reality of deliverable promises rather than fantasy.
And they've known this right from the very beginning. It's not like this has just dawned on them. They've got the same access to the same legal minds. They've known about this right from the beginning, but they'll just keep pushing it through to show how they're on the side of the people. And those naughty judiciary, those naughty rich fat cats like you are getting in the way.
Trisha, they should have called Joseph. I could have saved them a whole load of money.
And that's what we'll be doing again next week. I love these sessions with you because you make it real. You make it real. We peel away at the layers of poo-poo. I'm allowed to say that, aren't I? You'd know legally. You can represent me if I'm not. But we peel away at the layers to get to the truth. Joseph Kotrie Monson, lawyer and broadcaster, and just so illuminating. Thank you so much for your time.